You know, before I get started and wait for my slide deck to come on, I want to thank Charles for bringing up issues around race relations and white supremacy. It's never fun having to be the person of color that has to raise that in the room, so thank you. Appreciate that. And that's really hard to see, isn't it? It's a little bit better. Well, I'll talk you guys through the slides, and if you have questions, find me afterwards. But yes, thank you so much to the COCAP team for inviting me to share a little bit about my work and the journey that I've been on for the past few years. I'll start off by letting you all know that I come to this work as someone who has been doing community organizing, knocking on doors in Oakland related to issue-based campaigns. I've also done work around electoral organizing, really trying to figure out what it takes to get progressive leadership into positions of leadership in our city. And then even on policy advocacy, really trying to understand what are the policies that we can create to really help and transform our communities. And one of the things I learned over the years of turning community members out to testify at city council meetings or knocking on doors is that so many of the conversations that end up shifting how these decisions end up playing out happen long before we even knew it was an issue. They happen in back rooms and backdoor deals where people are deciding how we structure and shape our communities. And it's hard because our communities, they don't have invitations to those tables. They don't know that those tables exist. And then even the conversations that are happening there around finance and capital, these same low-income impacted communities have not been given the skills and the opportunities to understand all the jargon around ROI and IRR and all those other terms that we use to really determine a market. We use to determine a business that's profitable. And so I joined the work of the impact investment movement, I guess we'll call it that, or new economy, to really understand what it would take to support low-income communities of color to be able to engage in this space. And over the years, I have designed approach to my work, and I refer to it as restorative economics. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why I see restorative economics as distinct from the new economy movement. But first off, I'll start by sharing last year when I was invited to speak. I was asked to touch on issues of race in the new economy. And so as just a kind of a refresher for those of you that weren't with us last year, I spent time talking about how the system of extraction, be it, ooh, that's still really hard to see. I am so sorry. I thought I was cute when I was putting all these colors together. My apologies. Well, I'll keep talking you through it. The system of extraction is not only extraction of natural resources and labor, but also extracting people out of their homes. And we see that play out in the system of mass incarceration. Exclusion happens with policies and practices that deny certain groups the opportunities to participate in certain markets or certain economies. So we've also seen this with the history of redlining. We've also seen this around anti-immigration policies. Accumulation is what happens once people who have been denied access to participate in the economy, others then come in, swoop, and grab up whatever is left. And I should be more explicit in saying this is usually white, wealthy people who have the means and the ability to accumulate more. And then this goes into control, right? The ability for people that have more wealth, more resources, to then control how our societies are shaped and how our communities are developed. So last year when I did this, I spent some time talking about systems. I talked about the education system, the housing system. I wanted to break it down on a more granular level and talk about a specific project or business, because I think that's what a lot of us are up to. So raise your hand if you use Airbnb ever. I do too. It's a great service, especially when I'm traveling internationally. I really enjoy it. And Airbnb has been an institution that's been upheld as kind of the poster child for the sharing economy, or kind of what people see as the entry point into the new economy. So I kind of just want to spend some time breaking down how our actions as a business, regardless of our intentions, what the impact can actually be on communities. And so when it comes to extraction as it relates to Airbnb, we've actually seen in Oakland and in the Bay Area at large, we've seen a number of affordable housing short-term rental units taken off of the market. What ends up happening is that this then reduces the supply of affordable housing, increases the demand, which ends up increasing the overall price. So for those of us that are economists, remember our supply and demand curve, we can kind of get the hint of why we can now see a 2-bedroom in Oakland for over $2,500. And then what ends up happening is that this leads to displacement. So people who were not able to then engage in the short-term rental economy, or people who are not able to afford the increased housing prices, they end up getting displaced. And if you have a chance to kind of go around Oakland while you're here, you'll probably see that under pretty much any underpass, you will see tent cities. You will see families who have not been able to stay in their homes and have now been forced to live out on the streets. And then how this goes into accumulation is that those landlords, those individuals that may have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units are then able to use the profits that they've earned from their short-term rental units to then buy more houses and continue to accumulate more. And then that comes back to control in the way that Airbnb was able to use $8 million. They led an $8 million campaign to defeat Proposition F. Proposition F in San Francisco was an initiative to put regulations on short-term rental housing units. And although community organizations organized and they fought back against it, I can guarantee you that if you were to combine the budgets of those organizations, they did not amount to $8 million. And so this ends up showing us how even the unintended consequences of a business like Airbnb, the devastating impacts that it has on people. And I lift this up because I think we're called in this moment, as we're trying to build a we economy, to actually understand that we need to be deliberate, intentional, and rigorous in making sure that the strategies that we put out actually make sure that we don't leave more people locked out and left behind. I think we saw it with the digital economy already in the Bay Area, and I don't want the new economy to be the next thing where that happens. I think we're already seeing that those who are wealthier, wider, have the leisure time and the leisure capital to experiment and do new, exciting, innovative projects are those that have been able to benefit the most so far from the new economy. And I would offer that we have an opportunity to look at restorative economics as a way of actually bridging our polluting and extractive economy to move us forward into a just transition. And then the other piece that's worth highlighting is that as the problems that we face across the world are interconnected, be it climate change, climate refugees, the growing income inequality gap, just as those problems are interconnected, the solutions need to be interconnected as well. And so we need to be in a place of developing practices that move us from extraction to regeneration, from accumulation to shared prosperity, from control to governing from the whole, and then from exclusion to inclusion. And I think restorative economics puts us on a pathway to actually get there. So in its simplest terms, I define restorative economics as the process of prioritizing political resources, socioeconomic resources for communities most impacted by structural economic disinvestment. Ooh, that's even hard for me to read over here. And political disenfranchisement, resulting in systemic oppression. It's based on the simple idea that communities that have been left out and marginalized will better thrive with new economic models based on shared prosperity and community governance. So I also want to say I actually haven't shared this with an audience at large, so I'm really nervous, so be kind with me as I share with you some of my thinking on this work. Thank you. And sorry, this is the wrong slide, so I'm going to move really quickly. Here we go. So the first piece is really figuring out what community ownership could look like. We currently have an economy that is really focused on lifting up the individual, that glorifies the individual and recognizes their successes as independent from their connection with family, friends, culture, tradition. And that's actually simply not true. But it allows us to believe in the myth of the meritocracy, and it allows us to continue to tell people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I would offer that we have an opportunity to look at community ownership as a methodology for how we actually start to move forward and support communities and moving towards an economy of shared prosperity versus individual wealth. I think the other key piece to that is community governance. We currently have a broken democracy. We have a democracy that is based on the vestiges of slavery with our electoral college. We have a democracy where we've seen policies like Citizens United, and we've seen the ability for wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations to dictate what ends up happening. I think community governance is an opportunity for communities to actually figure out on a very local scale, how would we govern different? And how would we actually govern for the whole? This tradition around democracy where the majority wins is actually not the thing that's going to solve us out of the crises that we're in right now. We actually need an opportunity to figure out how do we develop solutions that benefit all people? And I'll go into governing for the whole in a bit. And I think that these two things are important because they put us on a pathway towards creating shared prosperity and self-determination, and being able to do that for political power. At the end of the day, my work is not just about supporting really amazing community-owned, community-governed projects, which they are, but my work is really about figuring out how do we then leverage those assets to be able to contest for power in a different way? And how do we put those communities that have been locked out and left behind on a platform to be able to actually say and control what happens over themselves and their communities? And so community-owned, community-governed projects present an opportunity for us to run experiments. Micro-experiments, it may be a parcel of land, it may be a building, it may be water infrastructure. But there are opportunities for us to figure out, are we willing to struggle together to share resources differently? Are we willing to struggle together to develop a new form of governance that supports the needs of all people? And so the process for getting there, I have kind of a three-step process. It makes sense in my head. Let me know what you think. But the first piece is around acknowledgement and repair. One of the best ways I've heard this described is, when you have a partner or somebody that you really love and care about, and you hurt them, and you know that you hurt them. When you want to make that relationship right, you will go through any lengths to acknowledge and take responsibility for your actions, and then to repair the relationship. Our economic system has created unimaginable harm and devastation to low-income communities of color across the country. And restorative economics requires us to really understand what is the harm that has been done and where are the places that we can create some repair. It forces us to not just create new innovative technologies, but to really wrestle with what are the root causes of the harm? Why do we have such a huge economic inequality gap in this country? How did we get here? Who were the decision makers at the time? What has the impact been on those communities, both emotionally, mentally, and physically? In restorative economics, we put the acknowledgement and repair of communities front and center, and building out the design of any project going forward. And so in our work at the Movement Strategy Center, we speak to this piece that we call the nested layers of human transformation. I think Charles had mentioned too that this moment that we're in is not just about an economic crisis, but it is also about a spiritual crisis. A spiritual crisis that takes place not only on the structural institutional level, but something that we also feel on the personal individual level. And so in order to bring about healing and repair, healing and wholeness, we actually do need to spend time thinking through the repair and reparations. And then we actually need to be able to pause, reflect, and understand the habits and patterns that got us here. And then be in a place of having a conscious choice about doing something different. We got to this place as a country because it was intentional, it was deliberate, and it was rigorous. And in order to get us out of the moment that we're in, we need to be just as intentional, deliberate, and rigorous. And so every choice we make, we need to be asking ourselves, is this actually reinforcing the same system of oppression that got us here, or is it helping to move us out of it? And the transformation happens in a way in which when we shift ourselves on the personal level, then it also shifts how we show up within other groups, within our institutions, across culture, and across structures. I have my own personal practice. I do somatics therapy, and it has been a place for me to actually unpack my feelings around money and wealth. I also do seated meditation, because that really allows me to get grounded in the day. In my organization at Movement Strategy Center, we do Tai Chi. And we do Tai Chi because it allows us to move together as a group and build awareness and consciousness of how we're moving and interacting. And then once we're aware of how we're moving and interacting, we can then be in a place of choice around doing things differently. And so restorative economics challenges us to make conscious choices. And to make conscious choices because the level of restoration that needs to happen is deep and wide. I don't know if you guys heard, it was just announced that Canada will actually be providing 750 million Canadian dollars in reparations to Indigenous communities for those that were separated from the, yes, let's clap it up. And even though the money can actually fix the way that those communities were brutalized, their children were stripped away and put into schools, it helps to give them the resources to continue to start to rebuild. We can look across the country from Japanese internment to slavery to the way we treat immigrants in this country, and recognize that there's so many ways and opportunities. I actually see them as opportunities for us to repair relationships and restore these communities because they have a wisdom or brilliance that is actually needed to solve us out of the problems that we're in today. And so one of the projects I have the pleasure of working on is called Restore Oakland. I've been working on Restore Oakland for the past, I see you, thank you. I've been working on Restore Oakland for the past 2 years, and it's an initiative based in the Fruitvale area of East Oakland. We're two grassroots-based building organizations, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, have come together to create a restorative economics, a restorative justice training center. And so the impacted population that they are acknowledging and wrapping their business model around are those that are formerly incarcerated, and those that are on the pathway to being put into the school-to-prison pipeline, and then workers in the restaurant industry. This is a center that's actually really focused on making sure that we develop the leadership and capacity of those people and individuals to be able to solve a lot of the issues impacting Oakland. And so for me, it's one of the great models I've seen around community-owned projects and community-governed projects are really trying to figure out how we can restore communities and make them whole. So then the other piece is around collaborative governance. And collaborative governance being a process in which you do community-centered planning to build community capacity and power. You can't actually get equitable outcomes without having an equitable process. And so collaborative governance, and this is, I should say, this is the Twyford's 5-step model. It's not a model I developed, I just love and lift it up. It's a process of actually bringing together all the different stakeholders to really first commit to collaborating together. Are we actually willing and able to sit in a room together? And then can we co-define the problem? Right? Depending on where you're sitting on any particular issue, you may see the problem as different. And so let's have a shared understanding of what that challenge is. And then let's develop a process together. Let's develop a process that brings those voices into the room and those who aren't in the room to be able to engage and then figuring out what are the solutions and how we move forward, and then being able to move into action. And with collaborative governance, I like to bring forth this other model that I call governing for the whole. And I think this is a place where I'm asking us to possibly consider what could it look like to move from a conversation that's just about the majority or the supermajority in some elections to one around governing the whole. In any particular solution or any particular issue, can we spend the time to actually define who the most impacted communities are? Can we put them at the center? And then can we understand how their friends and family support them, how this issue impacts their neighbors, what's the broader community at large, and how this actually plays out in the region? If we were to look at the issue of housing crisis, and if we were to actually center houseless people at the core of that and then decide that everybody actually deserves a dignified place to live, that actually benefits all of us, right? And so this is a model where I think we actually get to wrestle with, when we center the most impacted communities, how can all of us benefit? While recognizing that cutting across that, there are systems and structures and power dynamics that are at play in terms of how those different levels of community interact. And so Governing for the Whole is a project that we engage in a lot of the projects that I work on, and really trying to get all the information on the table so that we can make a decision that benefits everyone. And so this is another project that I've been able to work on. It's called the Richmond Community Development Entity. And so not too long ago, UC Berkeley had decided to build a global campus in the city of Richmond, and community groups got together and really organized and advocated for community benefits, which is what we do when development happens. That project ended up following through. But the community groups came together and said, you know, we still actually want to have an entity that does development. We just want it to be equitable development. And we want to be part of the conversations, and we want to shape how it happens. And I think one of the myths around gentrification is that people often say low-income communities don't actually want development. Well, no, they do. They just haven't been seen as investment ready or investment worthy. And development has often happened in a way in which those same communities have been pushed out and left behind. And so the Richmond CDE is an initiative to create a community-owned, community-governed structure to do development in the city of Richmond, to really have an entity where a community member could sit on the board of an LLC that could then determine how that development happens, and then in time, being able to have that entity owned by the community. And so this is something that's exciting. Oh, yay! I think it's pretty exciting too. And I think one of the things that's also been extremely interesting is really figuring out, based on the legal entities that are available to us currently, be them LLCs, C3s, B Corps, cooperatives, so on and so forth, really trying to understand what are the entities that are most malleable for us to be able to create a governance structure that is actually rooted in community and rooted in shared prosperity. And so this is a planning committee that has been coming together over the last couple of years. At the end of this year, they will hopefully have their founding board in place, and early next year start to incorporate the organization so they can then engage in a community-driven planning process around setting community priorities for development. And so then the last piece really focuses in on community wealth. And I think some of the other speakers coming in later today will be able to speak on this in more detail. But I would offer that we have an opportunity to create shared prosperity in a way that it brings about the economic stability and the opportunity for low-income communities to live meaningful and dignified lives. And so I think some of the great examples that we've already seen across the country, around the world, and particularly in Oakland, has been around worker cooperatives. We have the Arizmendi Bakery. We also have Mandela Foods Cooperative in West Oakland, direct public offerings, and I think you guys know Jenny. She's the expert on that. So if you have questions on how to do a public offering, I couldn't tell you that. That's all Jenny. But being able to use those types of models where community members could actually invest in an initiative like the People's Community Market to make sure that West Oakland has a grocery store. And then even being able to think of things like the commons, or bringing that back. And I think David Boyler's in the audience somewhere, a friend of mine, and being able to actually understand what does it look like for communities to really reclaim the commons in a way in which we are stewarding the resources and assets together. I put Mondragon up on the slide because oftentimes people ask me about scale. Is this project scalable? And I have feelings about that question of scale because I believe in place-based, localized projects. But I do think Mondragon is an example of what it could look like to have a shared set of values across a community that then end up shaping a number of the different businesses and how they're structured. So then the other case study I wanted to lift up is the Buen Vivir Fund of Thousand Currents. I have the pleasure of serving on Thousand Currents board. And last year there was a gathering in Mexico City to create a fund. And to create a fund in collaboration where you actually brought together the investors and the grassroots partners to set the terms, the governing structures, and to actually sit and listen from the wisdom of people in the Global South who have been doing lending in a non-extractive way to really figure out how do you structure a fund that serves the needs of people. And so it's an opportunity for us to actually reflect on, we could actually do things differently. Like this notion of collateral where you have to put your home up or put your car up. In a community in Guatemala that's one of the members of the Buen Vivir Fund, because they are so committed to relationships, they actually put their relationships up as collateral. So if Conda were to have been engaging with this fund, and then Conda came to me and said, I think my friend Nwamaka, someone who I have deep relationships with, is trustworthy, is honorable, will engage with us, and will repay this loan, please invest in her, then they would actually see that as something that is honorable and worthy of investing in. So we have an opportunity to radically rethink how we do this work and what it looks like in different ways. So as we try to move from a place of extraction and accumulation and into one of regeneration and redistribution, this issue around wealth redistribution I just kind of want to lift up is, yes, it's about redistributing resources to communities that haven't had access to it before, but it's also about redistributing power. And that's actually really, really hard. Right? To actually go to an individual who may have inherited wealth, they may be willing to give that away as a philanthropic grant, but then to ask them, are you willing to wrestle with giving up some of your power and your control so that others can actually have the dignity and autonomy to determine what happens in their community? That is actually what is at stake. And so that is why the projects that I work with were very clear that it's not just about how are we owning this building or managing this resource, that it is about how are we positioning ourselves to contest for power in a different way. And we need to recognize that this work does not happen in a vacuum. This work happens in relationship to all the social movements that make it possible for a lot of our great projects to thrive and be successful. And that our work, if we are actually trying to transform our work, our economy, our work needs to be deeply connected in relationship with these movements. And we need to develop models that reinvest back into these social movements, those that are on the front lines, so that we can all continue to struggle together and move forward together. I'm out of time, so I'm quickly going to go through this piece, but it's just a set of principles I put together. I think some of you are familiar with using non-extractive finance, also being able to lift up the technical assistance providers that are values aligned to support our work. But the piece that I really want to start to wrap us up with is recognizing that there's a number of different initiatives that are happening across the country. And oftentimes funders come to me and they'll say, well, I see, that co-op over there is pretty cute, or that initiative over there is pretty awesome, but that there's not a movement, or that it's not to scale. And I would offer is that if we could start to actually connect relationships across a number of the great projects that are happening, and this is only a short list that I've put together. When we start to actually network ourselves and build relationships, we may actually start to be able to envision a different political movement around transforming our economy together. And I would also offer that I think, are my friends from the RSF Integrated Fellows Capital in the room? Okay, I see Nina. So when you're here, please take a moment to talk to Fox with Boston Ujima. Please take a moment to reach out to folks like Nina, because there are a lot of great projects that are happening. And if we could actually start to develop intentional relationships, we may be on a better pathway to solve this problem faster. Lastly, I would lift up that what's at stake right now is that years ago, was back in 2010, there was an initiative in Pajarito to create a mutual domestic water users association. It was a community that did not have access to water, so they created a community-owned, community-governed waters association to be able to build out water infrastructure in their community. And I would offer that in moments like what we're experiencing in Flint, Michigan, that's actually the type of intentionality that we want to be lifting up in terms of the projects that we put forward. We could actually start to position ourselves to transform a lot of the issues impacting our communities. So in terms of things to consider, I would also lift up that there's this concept around Sankofa. So Sankofa is you go back into the past and you bring it forth. So we all have the opportunity to look back into our traditional cultures, practices, and wisdoms to figure out what is there that we can learn from and how do we bring forth those same traditions in addressing the problems impacting us today. A set of friends and myself, we created a giving circle called Thrive Africa. And giving circles are known as susus in West Africa, where you come together and people put in money together. And we've created Thrive Africa to be able to support African immigrant and refugees in the United States as an invisibilized population. And so that was kind of our Sankofa, to bring the Susu tradition forward into how we address a lot of the issues impacting our communities today. We also need to spend time to make sure that we address the need for capacity building and human development. Our communities, since they have been locked out and denied access to so much of this information, we actually need to be willing to make long-term investments. I'm talking 5, 10, 15-year investments for them to gain the skills, the resources, and the knowledge to be able to be a part of this emerging new economy. And let's also practice radical transparency. Because we're in a moment of experimentation, I don't think that any one of us is going to have all the answers. And even though I love the projects that I work on, there are things to learn from that we can improve on and do better. So let's practice radical transparency and share information and share wisdom going forward. And so if there's one thing you take from my presentation, even though you couldn't see it, I hope you heard my voice, is that as we move forward, we need to be, once again, intentional, deliberate, and rigorous in centering the people in the process, in centering the people in the design, and centering the people in the outcomes. Thank you.